My wife cheated after 17 years. A DNA test proved the kids aren't mine. Now she pays alimony. The envelope sat on my desk like a bomb waiting to explode. Results from a private lab I never thought I'd need to contact. My hand shook as I tore it open, heart hammering against my ribs. One page of text destroyed 17 years of what I thought was a happy marriage. Looking back, I must have missed all the signs, ignoring what my gut was telling me, but not the obvious stuff you read about online. No sudden gym memberships or mysterious weekend trips. Nothing that screamed affair right away. It was quieter, I guess, a growing distance. Conversations that died when I walked into a room. The way she'd check her watch during family dinners, like she had somewhere better to be. We met through my cousin at a music festival in 2006. The attraction was instant. Her laugh, her confidence, the way she seemed completely comfortable in her own skin. After dating for 2 years, we got married in a small ceremony. I really thought we had it together. For 15 years, we raised our 2 kids, a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. I coached soccer teams and attended school plays. We had game nights and summer vacations, normal family stuff, nothing extravagant, just everyday life that I cherished. The first real crack appeared during a work event. My wife showed up late, which wasn't like her. She was always punctual. When I went to hug her, she smelled different, not overpowering, just there. When I mentioned it later that night, she laughed it off, blamed it on standing next to someone in the elevator. I believed her because, why wouldn't I? But then came the excessive texting, always with her phone, always typing. When I'd enter a room, she would have this small smirk on her face. Then she would put her phone away and look up at me. Kinda suspicious, I thought, but I also thought everyone values privacy. But combined with other changes, it began to nag at me. The business trips increased. Her marketing job had always required some travel, but suddenly there were more conferences, more client meetings, more nights away. The explanations made sense on the surface, but something felt wrong. One Tuesday in October, I came home early with an upset stomach. It had been bothering me all morning. As I walked up the driveway, you know how sometimes you're just glancing around as if you are walking in your neighborhood? I spotted an unfamiliar car parked down the street. Nice car, expensive. So as I go in the house, I noticed it was quiet, but then I heard a faint noise coming from the bedroom. You know how they say your body knows the truth before your mind catches up? My stomach twisted into knots as I stood at the bottom of the stairs. The house was too quiet. I should have made more noise, announced myself clearly. Instead, I moved silently up the steps, each one bringing me closer to something I would never ever forget. The door wasn't fully closed. Through the gap, I saw them, my wife and a man I'd never seen before, in our bed. The bed where we'd slept for 15 years, where we looked after sick kids and talked about our dreams, where I thought we were happy. Keep in mind, I am 6'4", 255 pounds in decent shape, with a little bit of a beer belly. I pushed the door open. They scrambled apart, but it was too late. My wife's face drained of color as she pulled the sheets up. The man looked everywhere but at me. I didn't yell, didn't throw things, took out my phone, took a couple of photos and videos, and got into that guy's face and told him to get out. After he left, I looked at my wife and just left. She called 27 times that night. I drove aimlessly, eventually checking into a hotel. The text messages piled up, explanations, apologies, promises, each one hollower than the last. 3 days later, I agreed to talk. We sat at a coffee shop in neutral territory. She cried, said it was a mistake, just physical, not emotional, as if that made it better. Said it had only happened a few times. I nodded, letting her talk. Then I asked a question that had been growing in my mind since that day. Are the kids mine? Her hesitation told me everything. The DNA test kit arrived in a plain cardboard box, 3 identical packages containing cotton swabs and sample tubes. The instructions were simple. Swab the inside of the cheek, seal in the provided container, mailed to the lab. Results in 5 to 7 business days. Getting the samples from the kids was the hard part. Not physically, they were easy enough to convince. I told them it was for a family health study, a little lie that burned my throat as I said it. They trusted me completely. These children I had raised since birth. The thought that they may not be mine biologically seemed impossible when I looked at them. My son had my crooked smile, or so everyone said. My daughter rolled her eyes in the same way I did when annoyed. Were these learned behaviors or genetic traits? I'd never questioned it before. The week of waiting was hell. I went through the motions at work as an accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing company. Numbers that usually made sense to me became meaningless symbols on a page. I'd catch myself staring at family photos on my desk, studying faces for similarities I might have missed. My wife kept trying to talk, to explain, said we could work through this with counseling. Well, not from my mindset. I wasn't going to try to work through this. She said the affair was over. I maintained enough distance to think clearly, staying with a friend who asked no questions. The results arrived via email first, with the official documents to follow by mail. I sat in my parked car outside my friend's house, phone in hand, unable to open the message for nearly an hour. When I finally did, the clinical language couldn't soften the blow. 0% probability of paternity for both children. My world tilted sideways. 17 years, not a single child was mine. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a systematic deception that spanned nearly 2 decades of my life. I drove to our house, her house now, I suppose. She must have been watching for me because the door opened before I reached it. One look at my face and she knew. Who's their father? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. She collapsed into a kitchen chair. It's complicated, uncomplicated. The truth came out in fragments. There had been others before the man I caught her with, including someone from her past before we met. The same man, off and on for years. She maintained contact with him throughout our marriage. Why not just leave? Why the charade? Because I loved you too. As if that made any sense at all. I asked when she knew for certain the kids were not mine. Turns out she had her own DNA test done years ago after our daughter was born. She knew all along. Every time I'd rocked them to sleep, kissed scraped knees, taught them to ride bikes, she knew they were not mine. Every Father's Day card, every love you dad, built on a lie. Do they know? Suddenly panicked at the thought of my children because they were still my children in every way that mattered. Finding out like this. No, nobody knows except me and him. The betrayal had layers I was still discovering. Each revelation was worse than the last. I had been living someone else's life, playing a role in a play where I didn't know the real script. I left without deciding what would happen next. The only certainty was that our marriage was over. The harder questions about the kids, about what kind of relationship we could salvage from this wreckage, would have to wait. For now, I needed a lawyer. I was so nervous when I walked into the lawyer's office. My attorney, a woman, reviewed my documents, the DNA results, bank statements, property records. In this state, infidelity doesn't automatically entitle you to more in the divorce, she explained. But paternity fraud, that's different, especially since you knew. My lawyer said, unfortunately, paternity fraud isn't a law yet. I had chosen her specifically for her reputation as thorough and uncompromising. My wife had always handled our legal matters before. Another red flag I'd missed. What about the kids? I asked. The question that kept me up at night. Legally, they're considered yours. You're on the birth certificates. You've acted as their father their entire lives. But given the circumstances, custody will be complicated. Complicated? Everything was complicated now. The divorce papers were filed the following week. My wife received them at work. She called immediately, frantic, begged to discuss it first. Too late for that. The initial hearing was set for 2 months out. Meanwhile, I moved into an apartment closer to my office. Basic furniture, blank walls. I couldn't bring myself to put up family photos. Were they even my family anymore? The kids were told we were having problems and needed space. A massive understatement. They stayed primarily with their mother, but came to my apartment for weekends. Those first visits were awkward, all of us dancing around the unspoken truth. They knew something major had happened, but not what. I couldn't bring myself to tell them, not yet, maybe not ever. My wife hired an expensive attorney from a prestigious firm. Her family had money, another advantage she'd always held in our relationship. But this time, the facts were on my side. In the conference room before our court appearance, her lawyer proposed a settlement, standard split of assets, joint custody, me paying child support and alimony since she'd worked part-time through much of our marriage to raise our children. Absolutely not, my attorney responded without even looking at me. She slid the DNA results across the table. Their counteroffer came the next day. Equal split of assets, shared custody, no support payments either direction. Again, we declined. The judge assigned to our case was a woman who had a reputation for being ruthless. When she reviewed the full evidence, the long-term deception, the paternity fraud, the impact on my relationship with children I'd raised as my own, her expression hardened. This court has seen many divorce cases involving infidelity, she said, but few with this level of deception over such an extended period. The final judgment came down like thunder. I received the house with an equalization payment to her for her portion of equity, my full retirement accounts, and no obligation for child support. Most surprisingly, the judge ordered my wife to pay me alimony for half the length of our marriage, 8.5 years, $900 per month. Not a lot, but it helps, I guess. Turns out my lawyer's legal team found out that besides her family having money, she was getting money from her dad each and every month. The custody arrangement would be decided separately, taking into account the children's ages and what they wanted. My wife's face went pale as the terms were read. Her attorney immediately announced their intention to appeal, but the judge's expression suggested it would be futile. As we left the courtroom, my wife tried to catch my arm. "This isn't about the money," she said. "You know that, right?" She was wrong. It wasn't about the money for me, but it was absolutely about justice, about consequences for actions that had derailed nearly 2 decades of my life. "The money is the least of what you owe me," I told her before walking away. The first alimony check arrived exactly 30 days after the divorce was finalized. I stared at it for a long time before depositing it. The $900 amount was okay, I guess, based on her executive level income and being daddy's girl and the course determination of what I was owed for the years of deception. The money felt simultaneously like justice and like blood money, but I deposited it anyway. 6 months into our new reality, the kids and I settled into a routine. They spent weekdays with their mother and weekends plus 1 weeknight with me. The custody arrangement was officially joint, but the practical schedule acknowledged their school location and established routines. Telling them the truth was the hardest conversation of my life. We sat in my living room, pizza barely touched on the coffee table. I'd consulted with a therapist beforehand, preparing for every possible reaction. "I'm still your dad. Nothing will ever change that. But there's something you should know about why Mom and I separated." Their reactions were as different as their personalities. My son, not biologically mine, but mine in every way that mattered, stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture fell from the wall. My daughter stayed, asking quiet, devastatingly direct questions I struggled to answer honestly without demonizing her mother. Later that night, my son returned. His eyes were red. Without a word, he hugged me for the first time since he decided at 12 that he was too old for such displays. We stood in the hallway, both pretending we were not crying. "You're my dad. I don't care what some stupid test says." The relationship with my ex-wife evolved into something coolly professional. No longer intimate enemies, just 2 people coordinating children's schedules via text message. The monthly payments arrived without fail. direct deposit now. I used much of it to set up college funds for the kids, the rest going to renovate the house I'd kept in the settlement. Some of our friends were surprised when they found out. A lot of them didn't say anything. Some of her friends stopped associating with her. Family gatherings became exercises in careful scheduling to avoid awkward overlaps. My parent, bless them, never wavered in considering the children their grandkids. DNA be damned. Dating again at 43 felt impossible at first. The trust issues were substantial. The first few attempts fizzled quickly, my inability to open up forming an invisible barrier. But eventually, I met someone through a community volunteer project, someone patient enough to understand my hesitation and baggage. 1 year after the divorce, I ran into the man from that day, the one I'd caught in my bedroom. He was at a gas station, and the recognition was mutual and immediate. For a moment, I thought about confrontation, about the satisfaction of physical retaliation. Instead, I just stared until he looked away first, unable to hold my gaze. He wasn't worth the assault charge. The alimony payments will continue for 7 more years, a monthly reminder of what happened, but also of my second chance. I'm saving part of each payment for a trip I've always wanted to take, thinking of it as a reclaiming those lost years. The kids are thriving despite everything. Teenagers are resilient in ways adults aren't. They have relationships with both parents, navigating the complexity with more grace than I could have imagined. As for me, I'm finding my way. Some days are harder than others, but I'm no longer living a lie. And there's freedom in that truth that makes even the hardest days worthwhile. Well, I am going to say one thing. If they ever pass a paternity fraud law, they will probably have to build more jails. There are millions of men paying for kids that are not even theirs.